Everyone assumed a disabled cowboy would die alone on his ranch, especially after 12 women had already rejected him sight unseen. Then, wife number 13 arrived, saw exactly what scared the others away, and shocked the entire territory with her response. What made her so different? The dust never settled on Eli Morrison's boots. Every morning, he'd limp out to check the fence posts along his property line, favoring his left leg like a man carrying invisible weight. His ranch sat 3 miles from town, close enough to see the church steeple on clear days, far enough that most folks forgot he existed. That's exactly how they liked it. See, the people of Cedar Falls had strong opinions about damaged goods. A cowboy with a busted leg might as well hang up his spurs, they figured. What use was a rancher who couldn't chase down stray cattle or mount a horse without wincing? Eli heard their whispers at the general store. Poor fellas living on borrowed time, they'd mutter, shaking their heads like he was already 6 feet under. But here's the thing about stubborn men. They don't die easy. Eli kept his small herd fed and his property maintained through sheer determination. Every fence post he hammered felt like a middle finger to the doubters. His cattle didn't care about his limp. The land didn't judge him for taking twice as long to complete his daily rounds. Only people seemed to have a problem with imperfection. Then there was the woman situation. Makes sense that nobody talked about it directly, right? Cedar Falls suffered from what you might call a mathematical crisis. 7 men for every woman, give or take. The gold rush and railroad work had drawn dozens of bachelors west, but families with daughters stayed back east where life felt safer. Saturday nights at the saloon looked like a monastery meeting. Men played cards and drank whiskey, but their eyes held that hollow look of fellows who'd given up on companionship. Some had been alone so long they'd started talking to their horses like old friends. Well, Eli understood loneliness better than most. His evenings followed the same ritual. Repair whatever broke that day, usually something involving barbed wire and his own clumsiness. Heat up beans and coffee over the wood stove. Read newspapers that arrived weeks late from Denver, learning about a world that moved faster than his wounded body ever could. Those newspapers contained something interesting, though. Page after page of advertisements from men seeking wives. Hard-working farmer seeks gentle woman for marriage and partnership. Established merchant desires educated lady to share comfortable home. Rancher with good prospects looking for devoted wife. The ads fascinated Eli like puzzle pieces scattered across newsprint. Each man told his story in 20 words or less, hoping some unknown woman would read between the lines and see potential instead of desperation. Some promised wealth they probably didn't have. Others offered adventure that might kill you. But what if honesty worked better than promises? The idea crept into Eli's mind like morning frost, slow, persistent, impossible to ignore. Maybe damaged goods deserved love too. Maybe somewhere back east lived a woman tired of safe choices and predictable men. Maybe it was time to write his own advertisement and discover what kind of woman answered letters from limping cowboys. Eli stared at the blank piece of paper for what felt like hours. Writing a letter to find a wife wasn't exactly something they taught cowboys. His rough hands, better suited for handling reins than holding a pen, cramped as he scratched out draft after draft. What do you even say to a woman you've never met? The truth was, most men out west were doing the exact same thing. Newspapers back east were filled with ads from lonely ranchers and miners. Honest, hardworking man seeks devoted wife. Established farmer desires companion for prairie life. The words all sounded the same after a while, but here's what made it work. Desperation on both sides. Well, maybe desperation is too harsh. Let's call it necessity. The typical mail-order bride was young, usually under 22, and running from something. Poverty topped the list. Strict fathers came in second. Some fled arranged marriages to men 3 times their age. Others simply craved adventure beyond their small town's borders. Makes sense, right? Eli knew he couldn't lie about his condition. His limp wasn't going anywhere, and any woman stepping off that stagecoach would notice it immediately. He'd seen other men paint rosy pictures of wealth and perfect health, only to have their brides turn around and head home the same day. The weird part is, honesty seems scarier than lying. After several crumpled attempts, he finally wrote something simple. Rancher with modest spread seeks educated woman for companionship and partnership. I walk with a limp from a rodeo accident, but work my land every day. looking for someone who values hard work over easy comfort. He added details about the ranch, the nearby town, and his hope for a family someday. Then, there's the waiting game. Eli posted his ad in 3 Eastern newspapers and settled in for what he figured would be weeks of silence. Most ads drew no responses at all. The lucky ones might get 2 or 3 letters from interested women. 3 weeks later, a single envelope arrived. The handwriting was neat, precise, definitely from someone with education. Clara Whitmore from Pennsylvania. A school teacher, just as he'd hoped for in his ad. Her letter surprised him. Instead of the usual promises to be a dutiful wife and mother, Clara wrote about wanting to see the frontier firsthand. She'd read every book about the West she could find, but books only told you so much. "I'm not running away from anything," she wrote. "I'm running towards something I can't even name yet." She asked practical questions, too. What did winters look like? How far was the nearest doctor? Did the town have a church? But she also wanted to know about the sunrise over the prairie and whether the night sky really held more stars than back east. Clara mentioned she wasn't afraid of hard work or simple living. Her father had been a farmer before becoming a preacher, so she understood both dirt under fingernails and the satisfaction of growing something from nothing. By the time Eli finished reading her letter twice, he was already planning his response. But first, he needed to prepare for the possibility that this educated Eastern woman might actually say yes to his proposal. The stagecoach rolled into town like a dust storm with wheels, creaking and groaning from the long journey across the prairie. Clara stepped down with her traveling dress wrinkled beyond recognition and dirt caked on her boots, but her spine stayed straight. Her eyes swept across the small crowd that had gathered, because nothing draws a crowd quite like fresh gossip arriving by stagecoach. The whispers started immediately. "That's the crippled cowboy's bride," one woman muttered to another. "Poor thing probably doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." A group of children pressed their faces against the general store window, staring like Clara was some exotic animal from a traveling circus. Makes sense, right? In a town where eligible women were rarer than honest poker players, every new arrival became instant entertainment. Clara heard every word. The West wasn't exactly known for subtle conversation, and these folks weren't trying to hide their thoughts. But instead of shrinking back or demanding the next stagecoach east, she did something unexpected. She dusted off her skirts, lifted her chin, and walked straight toward the comments with the confidence of a school teacher facing down unruly students. Then there was Eli, standing near the hitching post with his hat in his hands and worry written across his face. He'd been dreading this moment for weeks, wondering if Clara would take one look at the dusty streets and judgmental faces before climbing right back onto that stagecoach. His limp seemed more pronounced as he approached, each step careful and measured, while the townspeople watched. "Miss Clara?" His voice carried the nervous edge of a man who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. "That would be me." Clara extended her hand for a firm handshake that surprised half the onlookers. No delicate curtsy or feminine flutter. Just a direct greeting between equals. "You must be Eli. Your letters didn't mention how tall you are." The stagecoach driver hauled down Clara's trunk with a grunt. "Heavy as a load of stones," he complained, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Books," Clara explained without embarrassment. "About 1/3 books, actually. The rest is warm clothing and practical things." She wasn't apologizing, just stating facts like she might explain arithmetic to her former students back east. The weird part is how naturally she owned her choices, even with the whole town listening. Eli stared at the trunk, then at Clara, then back at the trunk. Most mail-order brides arrived with hope chests full of china and wedding linens. Clara brought an entire library. "Books are good," he managed, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "I thought you might show me this ranch I've heard so much about," Clara said, brushing dust from her sleeves. Her smile held steady despite the continued stares and whispered commentary from the growing crowd. Well, Eli thought, she's got more backbone than half the men in this town. But would that backbone hold up when she saw what daily life on a struggling ranch really looked like? Dawn came early on the ranch, and Clara learned that working beside Eli meant starting before the sun showed its face. She watched him struggle each morning, wrestling with his boots like they were stubborn animals. His injured leg made even simple tasks take twice as long. But Clara never offered to help unless he asked. Pride was about the only thing a man had out here, and she understood that. The cows didn't care about anyone's limitations. They needed milking at the same hour every day, rain or shine. Clara's hands cramped terribly at first. City fingers weren't built for gripping udders and squeezing milk into buckets. By the third week, though, calluses formed where blisters used to be. Makes sense, right? The human body adapts faster than the human spirit sometimes. Then, there were the gates. Broken fence posts and sagging wire seemed to multiply overnight like weeds. Clara learned to hammer nails without smashing her thumb too often. Well, most of the time anyway. Eli showed her how to stretch wire tight enough to keep cattle in, but not so tight it would snap in winter cold. These weren't skills they taught at the schoolhouse back east. One moonless night, something got into the chicken coop. Clara woke to frantic squawking and feathers flying everywhere. By morning, 3 hens were gone, nothing left but scattered feathers and coyote tracks in the dirt. Eli's face went dark with frustration. Losing chickens meant losing eggs, and eggs meant money they didn't have to spare. But Clara had an idea. She remembered reading about animal behavior in one of her books. Coyotes were smart, but they were also creatures of habit. They'd come back to the same spot, expecting another easy meal. So Clara and Eli rigged up a trap using chicken wire and some old rope. The next night, they caught 2 young coyotes red-handed, or red-pawed if you want to get technical about it. The ranch hands noticed everything. These weren't men who missed details. When Jake and Rusty saw Clara hauling water buckets and fixing fence posts, they started whispering among themselves. A week later, Jake approached Eli with his hat in his hands, said he was moving on to greener pastures. Rusty followed 2 days after. They never said it outright, but everyone knew why. Working for a gimpy cowboy and his mail-order bride didn't seem like a winning proposition. Food got simpler after the hired help left. Beans every night, sometimes with a strip of bacon if they were lucky. Coffee that could strip paint off a barn door. Clara had brought some recipes from Iowa, but ranch ingredients didn't stretch that far. Fresh bread became a Sunday luxury. Fruit was something you remembered from better times. And the weird part is, Clara didn't complain. Not once. She stirred those beans like they were the finest stew in the territory. But Eli noticed how she sometimes stared off toward town, probably wondering what she'd gotten herself into. The real test was coming, though neither of them knew it yet. Whispers spread through town like wildfire on dry grass. Clara had been there barely 2 weeks, and already the gossip mill was working overtime. Mrs. Henderson from the general store claimed Clara must be running from something back east. "No decent woman travels that far for a crippled cowboy," she'd mutter to anyone who'd listen. Others wondered if Clara was desperate, maybe too old, too plain, or too difficult for the men back home. The storekeeper, Mr. Jameson, made his feelings clear when Clara walked in for supplies. He looked right through her like she was invisible. When she asked for flour and sugar, he suddenly became very busy organizing already perfect shelves. Clara stood there for 10 minutes before another customer finally shamed him into serving her. Even then, he practically threw her change on the counter. But here's the thing about Clara. She wasn't the type to hide in shame. Come Sunday, she marched right up to Reverend Phillips after church. "I'd like to teach reading lessons," she announced loud enough for half the congregation to hear. "Too many children in this town can barely write their own names." The Reverend blinked in surprise, but several mothers perked up with interest. Education was scarce out here, and they knew it. What most folks didn't realize was how common Clara's situation actually was. A recent newspaper article from back east revealed something shocking. 60% of marriages in the Old West started through letters. Mail-order brides weren't desperate women. They were practical ones. The numbers made sense when you thought about it. Men needed wives, women needed opportunities, and the railroad made it all possible. Still, knowing the facts didn't make the stares any easier to bear. Eli watched Clara handle the town's cold shoulder with quiet dignity, but inside, he was falling apart. Every whispered comment, every turned back, every suspicious glance felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Had he been selfish, bringing her here? Back east, Clara probably had friends, maybe even suitors who didn't limp around like a broken-down horse. She could have taught in a real schoolhouse instead of volunteering her time to ungrateful ranchers' kids. Late at night, when Clara was already asleep, Eli would sit on the porch and wonder if she regretted answering his letter. Maybe the adventure she'd written about wasn't worth the isolation and judgment. Maybe she was just too polite to admit her mistake. The weight of doubt pressed down on him heavier than any hay bale he'd ever lifted. Every morning brought new challenges, and winter was coming fast. If the ranch failed, if the town never accepted them, if Clara decided she'd had enough of this hard life, well, Eli wasn't sure he could handle losing the one good thing that had happened to him in years. What he didn't know was that nature was about to test them both in ways that would make the town's gossip seem like nothing more than childish chatter. The storm hit without warning on a Tuesday night, turning the sky black as coal. Rain hammered the ranch like bullets from heaven, and lightning split the darkness every few seconds. Clara had seen plenty of weather back east, but nothing like this. The wind howled so loud she couldn't hear Eli shouting from across the room. By morning, half their world was underwater. The barn looked like a lake with a roof poking out. Corn stalks that had been knee-high yesterday now floated like green confetti. Eli limped through the mud, cursing under his breath at each step. His bad leg made every movement a struggle, and Clara could see the frustration burning in his eyes. Then she heard it, the desperate whinnying of horses in trouble. 2 young colts were trapped near the old oak tree, stuck in mud up to their bellies. The harder they fought, the deeper they sank. Most folks would have written them off as lost, but Clara wasn't most folks. She grabbed a rope and waded into the mess without thinking twice. "Clara, don't!" Eli called out, but she was already waist-deep in the muck. The first colt was easier than expected. A little coaxing and some strategic pulling got him free. The second one proved stubborn as a mule with a toothache. Clara spent 20 minutes sweet-talking that horse while mud soaked through her dress. When both animals finally stood on solid ground, she looked like she'd been wrestling with the earth itself. But here's where things got worse. All that stress and worry had taken its toll on Eli. That night, his old rodeo injury flared up something fierce. The scar tissue around his hip reopened, and by Thursday morning, he couldn't even sit up without wincing. Clara found him trying to get dressed, his face pale as milk. "You're staying in bed," she announced, using her schoolteacher voice. The ranch hands, who hadn't already quit, took one look at the flooded mess and decided this was their cue to leave. Can't blame them, really. Working for a bedridden boss and his Eastern bride didn't seem like a winning bet. Within a week, Clara was running the place alone. Neighbors started dropping by with helpful suggestions. "Maybe you should head back east," old Mrs. Henderson offered. "This life ain't meant for delicate women." Another visitor suggested Clara could find work in town while Eli recovered. The unspoken message was clear. Abandon ship before you both drown. Well, Clara had news for them. She spent her days hauling water, feeding what livestock survived, and nursing Eli back to health. Her hands blistered from work she'd never imagined doing. Her back ached from lifting feed sacks, but every evening she'd sit by Eli's bedside and read aloud from her books, proving she wasn't going anywhere. Something interesting happens when a person refuses to quit when everyone expects them to. But what Clara did next would surprise the whole town. Clara knew something had to change. The storm had nearly destroyed everything. But it also showed her what this community was really made of. Most folks had written them off completely. Time to prove them wrong. She decided to cook, not just any meal, a proper Sunday dinner that would make her grandmother proud. Clara spent 3 days planning, using what little they had left after the flood. Beans and bacon, fresh biscuits made from their last good flour, and stew thick enough to fill hungry bellies. The smell alone could probably convince half the town. Sunday morning arrived with crisp air and nervous energy. Clara had invited everyone after church, though she wasn't sure anyone would actually show up. Eli hobbled around the kitchen, still favoring his reopened wound. "You think they'll come?" he asked, arranging mismatched chairs around their small table. "They'll come if they're hungry enough," Clara replied, stirring the pot one more time. The first knock came at noon. Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch with her twin boys, both covered in dirt as usual. "Smells good in there," she said simply. Behind her, more families appeared like cautious deer approaching a watering hole. Soon, their small cabin overflowed with neighbors. Kids sat cross-legged on the floor while adults found spots wherever they could. Clara served everyone first, making sure plates stayed full. The conversation started quietly, then grew louder as people relaxed. Young Tommy Morrison asked Clara to tell them about Iowa. She launched into a story about her uncle's prize pig that kept escaping to court the neighbor's sow. The children giggled. Even the serious-faced men cracked smiles when she described how the pig learned to unlatch gates with his snout. But here's what really changed things. Clara didn't try to impress anyone. She burned the first batch of biscuits and laughed about it. She admitted she still couldn't milk their stubborn cow without getting kicked. People saw her as real, not some fancy Eastern lady putting on airs. Mrs. Henderson and Sarah Mitchell stayed after everyone else left. They helped Clara clean dishes while discussing vegetable gardens. "I've got extra tomato seeds," Mrs. Henderson offered, "and Sarah here knows which beans grow best in this soil." The following week brought unexpected visitors. Men stopped by to ask Eli about fixing their broken equipment. Nobody mentioned his limp anymore. They talked business, weather, and cattle prices like he was just another rancher. Word spread that the mail-order couple wasn't so strange after all. Clara's Sunday dinners became a monthly tradition. Their tiny cabin somehow stretched to accommodate whoever showed up hungry. The ranch began recovering faster than anyone expected. When you've got neighbors willing to lend tools and share advice, impossible tasks become merely difficult. Clara's garden flourished under the guidance of women who'd been farming this land for decades. Eli started walking taller despite his permanent limp. Acceptance has a way of healing wounds that medicine can't touch, but the real test of their transformation was still coming. Spring arrived like a gentle promise kept. The ranch that nearly died in last year's storm now buzzed with new life. Baby calves wobbled on unsteady legs while their mothers grazed peacefully in green pastures. Clara's garden exploded with color. Sunflowers reaching toward the sky, tomatoes heavy on their vines, and rows of beans that would feed them through winter. But here's what nobody expected. Clara had turned the old barn into something extraordinary. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, children gathered on hay bales while Clara taught them to read. She used simple books at first, then graduated to newspapers and even poetry. The weird part? Adults started showing up too. Ranch hands who'd never learned their letters sat beside 8-year-olds, sounding out words with the same determination they used to break wild horses. "Reading opens doors," Clara would say, her voice carrying across the barn. "And out here, we need all the doors we can get." The transformation didn't stop there. Eli found himself invited to join the town council, the same group that had once whispered about the crippled cowboy behind his back. His first meeting felt awkward, sure, but when they discussed building a new schoolhouse, Eli's practical suggestions about location and materials earned nods of approval. Makes sense, right? A man who'd rebuilt his own ranch from scratch knew something about construction. Then there's the ripple effect nobody saw coming. 3 more mail-order bride advertisements appeared in the local newspaper within 2 months. Cowboys who'd watched Eli and Clara's success decided to try their own luck at finding wives through letters. The postmaster complained good-naturedly about the sudden increase in correspondence flowing east. "Seems like half the territory's writing to women they've never met," he chuckled while sorting mail. Clara kept every letter she received from other mail-order brides asking for advice. Women wanted to know what to expect, how to prepare, whether the stories of Western hardship were true. She answered each one honestly, never sugarcoating the challenges, but emphasizing the possibilities. Well, the ranch books told their own story. For the first time since Eli's accident, they showed a real prophet. Not just surviving, thriving. The combination of Clara's practical skills and Eli's determination had created something stronger than either could have managed alone. Evening became their favorite time. They'd stand together on the front porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Eli no longer worried about his limp defining him. Clara had found the adventure she'd craved, though it looked different than she'd imagined. "You know what I realized?" Clara said one evening, leaning against the porch railing. "What's that?" Eli asked. "We're not the same people who wrote those first letters." And the interesting thing is, their story was just beginning to influence others in ways they couldn't have predicted. But that influence would soon extend far beyond their small corner of the territory.